Hello everyone, and welcome to the Velas Account integration tutorial. This tutorial consists of 4 parts: creating a relying party account, installing and running the transaction sponsor, creating a React app with all the necessary dependencies, and writing the authorization code. If you have already done some parts of the tutorial on your own, feel free to skip to the parts you need. These 4 sections are highlighted as timestamps, but you can also find the timeframes in the description of this video. We're going to be using Testnet instead of Mainnet, but the flow remains identical. So first things first, we need to create something that's called a relying party account. In a nutshell, it's an account on the Velas blockchain which holds important information in regards to your integration with Velas Account. If you want to read more about it, there will be a link in the description of this video. Anyways, what data does it require, why, and where to create one? In order to create a relying party account, you need to provide 4 things. Application name, which will be later used to show what the user is logging into, icon CID, which is an IPFS image ID to show your icon to the user when managing current sessions, redirect URIs, which are the links to redirect the user back to after a successful authorization, and lastly, the domain name, which is just a link to your website. It should be pretty clear why we require this data at this point, so let's proceed to creating a relying party account. You're going to want to head to this address. FYI, all the links, both Mainnet and Testnet, will be in the description of this video. So the first thing you need to do after you open up the page is to sign in with Velas Account. I'm going to walk you through the process of creating a new account and logging into the website. Press sign in, you will be redirected to Velas Account. Press sign up, make sure you write down your seed phrase somewhere safe, copy the seed phrase, press I wrote everything, paste it here, and click verify phrase. Now you're going to need to wait a bit for the account to be created. Once that's done, you can press skip, approve the permissions, and you're done. Here you will need to fill out some information about your company for us to know you better. Everything except email, company name, and integration stage is optional. Here is the main part, the data of which we've already discussed. Please make sure you separate the redirect URIs with a space, not a comma. Typically, you would want to specify localhost with the desired port as well as your main domain. Be sure to specify the root which handles the authorization in your app. For the purpose of this video, I'm only going to use localhost with the default 3000 port, which is perfect for our current needs. After you fill everything out, click Next, confirm, wait a couple of seconds and copy the relying party account address, which is also known as client ID. I suggest pasting it somewhere like notes, so you won't lose it right away. You may already know this, but transaction sponsoring is one of the flagship features of the Velas blockchain. We've taken advantage of that and implemented sponsors into Velas Account. Creating a sponsor is very straightforward. It's essentially a Node.js backend server which handles all the transaction broadcasting and pays the fees for the selected transaction types. We are providing a repository which contains a rudimentary sponsor so you wouldn't have to code everything yourself. Head on to this link, click code, and copy the HTTPS link. Now you're going to want to clone this repo into any folder you like. The next step is running npm install, and after the dependencies have finished installing, go ahead and run npm start. It will result in an error, but it will also generate the data we need to start the sponsor appropriately. As you can see in the console, it says to get started with testnet, you can use these values. Go ahead and copy those values, then create a .env file in the root of the project. Open the newly created environmental variables file and paste your copied values. Run npm start again. It's going to start the sponsor and you will see your sponsor address in the console, next to current sponsor. Notice that it's running on port 3002, we're going to need that info later. Conveniently, it's asking us to fund our sponsor so it could actually sponsor something, so let's go ahead and do that. If you're in Mainnet, you would need to buy some tokens and transfer them to the sponsor address, but since we're using Testnet, we're just going to take advantage of the faucet. Open up a new terminal window and run Velas airdrop. Then the value 10, the sponsor address, 2 dashes, URL, and the RPC link. This command will only work if you've installed the Velas CLI. If you haven't, pause the video, go to this link, and install it. Make sure you add it to the path if you're on macOS. Now that we have a functional sponsor with an actual balance, we can move on to making our tiny authorization app. Let's start by creating a React app with CRA, although I should mention that you may use any generator you're comfortable with. After your application is created, we're ready to move on to the next step. Let's go ahead and run the app. As you can see, we've got a default React application, which is perfect for our needs. Let's start by installing Account Client, which is a dependency that makes login with Velas Account possible. We also need to install Velas Web 3 for everything to work correctly. Right, so this is the part where things get slightly more intense. We need to create a new JavaScript file, or TypeScript depending on your codebase, which I will call vaclient.js. Let's start off by importing the account client itself. Velas Account stores various necessary data in local storage, and that's currently the best approach for all browsers. If that were to change, we provide an opportunity for you to use your own storage handlers instead of ours. Let's use the default ones for now though. The next step is creating an empty agent object, which will fill itself later down the line. We need to export it so it would be accessible from other files. Then we need to export another variable, which will be an initialized VA client. Now we need to fill it with the necessary properties. The first one is called mode. That determines the default way to open Velas Account. It supports redirect, which simply redirects the user to Velas Account, logs him in, and redirects back. And pop-up, which opens Velas Account in a new browser window. I will use redirect for this tutorial. The next two properties are client ID and redirect URI, the value of which we've already got after creating a relying party account earlier. Client ID is your relying party address, and redirect URI is essentially a link to redirect back to after a successful authorization. Now, as for redirect URI, we're going to put HTTP localhost 3000 because we're running it locally. You should definitely change that value to your domain that you specified earlier before deploying. I suggest storing those values in environmental variables because they will change depending on the network, that being Testnet or Mainnet, and whether you're running it locally or not. However, if you don't know how to do that, there's nothing wrong with just putting them directly in this file. Then we need to put the previously imported storage handlers here like so. The next two are account provider host and network API host, which heavily depend on the network you're using. Because we're using Testnet, the values are the following. Notice how the first link doesn't have a protocol in front and a slash at the end. This is crucial for everything to work. If you were using Mainnet, you would just need to replace Testnet with Mainnet in both of those links and you would be good to go. The last two properties are the reason we were bothering with creating the sponsor. The API host is the link to our sponsor, so that would be localhost 3002 in our case. And the pub key is the public key of the sponsor's account. Once again, I recommend putting the previous four variables into the .env file, and if you needed to change the network to Mainnet, you would just need to replace Testnet with Mainnet in every link. Congrats, the hard part is officially done. Let's move on to the exciting stuff. Open up the app.js file and import our newly created VA client structure. Let's also import useState. We will need to create local states for the user info and session data. After that, let's create a button which will authorize our user. Now let's add an onClick event on that button. We're going to utilize the authorize method of VA client in this arrow function. The next step is to fill the authorize function with the necessary properties. Authorize accepts two parameters, an object with the authorized settings and a function that processes the authentication result. Let's start with the object. It requires two properties, CSRF token and scope. The first is essentially a function that fetches the CSRF token from the sponsor, or a custom backend. As you may remember, our sponsor is running at port 3002, so we specify that in the fetch request along with a CSRF endpoint. Now we need to write the details of the request. The type is GET. The headers just have content type, which is application JSON. The next step is to get the token from the response and return that token. Now as for the scope, that's a list of permissions you are requesting. I'm going to use transfer and execute for this tutorial. The next step is to write a function that will handle the authorization result. I'm going to write it directly here as an example, but feel free to make it a standalone function. It accepts two parameters, the error and the authentication result. First of all, we need to replace the history state with just our current root. This is done to remove the token from the address bar. Then, if we get an auth result, and the auth result has an access token payload, we need to set our session data local state to the authentication result, and then we have to get the user info based on the access token. Let's call VA client user info, pass the access token as the first prop, and pass a callback to validate the result as the second. If we get an error, we need to set the session data to null because it is invalid, and then we can validate the error we get. If it says failed authorization, it means that the session was terminated and it's no longer valid. Anything else should be treated as a normal error. If everything succeeds though, we need to set the user info to the result.userinfo. So the major part of the code is done. The next step is to show our user address after successful authorization. We can utilize our local state for that. Let's create a paragraph under the button, which will be conditionally rendered. If both the user info and the session data are not empty, we can render the paragraph with the user's address. Let's also add some text to our button so we can see it better on the website. Now if we head to our browser and click the button, we will be redirected to Velas Account. Let's make use of the express sign up, click confirm, and we're redirected back to our authorization app. Now as you can see, the login works fine, but we can't see the user address. That's because we need to do one more thing. Let's head back to the code and make our function that processes the authentication result a standalone one, because we will need to call it one more time. Now let's import useEffect from React and write the hook itself. The dependency array would be empty because we just need to execute this on component did mount. UseEffect is not the best hook in this scenario, but it's the easiest one to show. Feel free to use whatever you think is best. Here we need to write VA client handle redirect callback and put our function inside it. Now everything should work as intended. Let's go back to the browser and make sure that it does. As you can see, everything functions perfectly. This was a pretty lengthy tutorial, but nevertheless, I hope you enjoyed, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in our developers Telegram group. All the code from this video will be accessible in a GitHub repo, the link to which you will find in the description. Thank you for watching and have a great day.